Okay, so I posted a rather heated response to a white Australian man who thought it was his place to scold and condescend to the American people. And it's really interesting to look at the kinds of comments that I got in response. And there was one comment that I got both on YouTube and on Instagram that really highlighted like an area that I think we need to discuss. It really drew my attention to the fact that I think a lot of people don't understand what it means to be an American and the ways that Americans have or have not been involved in politics and civic life, and what the barriers have been. Why is it that so many Americans have not stopped fascism before now? Why is it that so many Americans are checked out, or that you think that they're checked out, right? So I had somebody in my comments who said that people outside the United States had every right to be upset with us, and that people outside the United States were often more informed about our politics than we are. To which I would say, I don't actually think that that's true, but also I do acknowledge that a lot of Americans are not particularly invested in politics at all. A lot of Americans are fairly checked out and have very minimal interface with American politics. But this is the core of the issue. This is the crux of the issue. I think that a lot of people misunderstand why that is. There's a lot of presumption that Americans are apathetic, that Americans don't give a shit, either that we passively support the regime, or we just can't be bothered, or we don't care about people around the world. We don't care about the harm that our government is doing. We're apathetic, or we're ignorant and clueless and what have you, right? That's the framing that I get, especially when people say, like, I'm not in the US and I know so much more than you guys do. I'm so much more deep in the weeds of American politics than the average American. What do you want? You want a cookie for that? That's great. That's great that you have the time and the bandwidth and the energy and the access to know so much about American politics. Although I would argue that a lot of what you see is not the whole picture, right? Especially if you're getting your news from any American news source. And honestly, like, not to snark, right? That's great that you're interested in what's happening here, and that's great that you're invested. And I understand that our imperialist government does really bad things abroad and has used our tax dollars to do really horrific things. And so I understand why, as a world superpower, people who are not in the United States want to know what is happening in American politics and what kind of policy we are crafting and what kinds of terrible things our government is up to. But just because you know a lot about American politics, or you think that you know a lot about American politics, that doesn't mean that your average American who knows less than you, or is less involved, less, up to their eyeballs in punditry than you are, doesn't care. It's a false premise. It's a fallacious argument to say that because you know a lot, because you have the time and capacity to read all of the think pieces and to watch all of the talking heads have their, their huge video essay, and because you have the time to read all of the Substacks and what have you, and look at all of the debate, whatever, because you have time for all of that, that Americans who don't know as much as you do are simply apathetic. And so I want to explain this here a little bit, because maybe people outside the US don't understand that, yeah, a lot of Americans kind of know fuck all about American politics and kind of don't take their civic duty as seriously as they should. But there's so many factors at play that contribute to that. And it's really easy to blame working class Americans for their lack of involvement and for their, presumptive ignorance. When we don't really understand the root causes. Our struggle is against systems, not against people. I'll keep quoting Linton Kwesi Johnson as long as I need to for folks to understand our struggle is against systems. It's not against people. And the system has made sure that your average American is ignorant, right? Republicans have spent decades eroding public education in this country to reach the point. Sorry, my family just got home from a Magic the Gathering tournament. Hang on. So your average American faces a diminished access to education, right? Especially if they live in a Republican state, especially if they live in the South. So you have a population that is intentionally denied education and access by the government because, you know what, Donald Trump says he loves the uneducated. It's much easier for the Christo-fascists. It's much easier for the Republicans to control people when they control access to knowledge and information. I actually have a video coming out on this tomorrow. There's a reason that fascists go for the libraries and the parks and the museums and universities. And Republicans have been doing that for decades. So you have a lot of Americans who don't understand basic government. They don't have a good, foundation in civics, and they don't really understand the way that government works. And they definitely don't understand how other systems of government work, and they don't understand how lobbying works. They don't understand the power of the oligarchy in this country at all. You have people who are deeply ignorant of the truth of the situation, and that is by design of the system. And then you add this whole other layer to it that, when I see people from countries like Canada and Australia and countries in Europe that have universal healthcare, that have socialized medicine, who get into our comments and will say things like, Americans just don't, you guys can't be bothered with politics. I know way more about your politics than you. I'm more involved than you guys are. It tells me that you don't understand that your average American, we first of all, we have no social safety nets, especially now that Republicans are in power. There are no social safety nets in this country. The average American is one crisis away from homelessness, and your average upper middle class American is two crises away from homelessness. Realize the phrasing is not super PC, it's not super woke, but America really is a third world country in a billionaire trench coat. Our wealth is consolidated amongst 500 people, right? The average American is working 2-3 jobs. The average American is struggling to keep their head above water. They don't have childcare. They often don't have healthcare. If they have healthcare, it's very expensive. The average American has a lot of debt, and the number one reason Americans file for bankruptcy is medical debt. And I want you to understand that this is by design. They have tied our healthcare to our employment so that we are, dependent. We can easily be exploited by our employer because we can't leave our job for a better situation, because then our children will lose access to life-saving healthcare. We will lose access to life-saving healthcare. And so people are strapped to jobs where they are being exploited, where they are not being paid a living wage, where they're struggling really hard. And people in the United States have to get 2-3 jobs. In fact, it's become very popular. Sorry, my dog's going to bark here in a second. It's okay, buddy. It's become very popular for employers to offer just below full-time, right? They don't want to offer you one full-time position. So they'll offer you 0.75, and then they don't have to provide you with healthcare at all. So you have, especially Gen Z, working 2-3 jobs that are each giving 15, 20, 25 hours a week, no healthcare at all, no job stability, no living wage at all. When you are constantly struggling to pay your bills, when you are barely able to keep your head above water, you do not have the bandwidth or the capacity to be involved in politics. So you start out ignorant, you struggle your whole life, you spend all of your time trying to provide for your children, trying to keep a roof above your head. You have no childcare, you have no safety nets, you have no bandwidth at all to get invested in politics. Those of us who have the capacity, who have the time, who have the energy to be really politically involved, we either come from a position of privilege or we have been raised in a paradigm that is different than the average American. We are more informed, more educated, more activated. But the average American simply does not have the time and the energy, right? Working 2 jobs, coming home exhausted, trying to help your kids with their homework, worried about all of the debt that you're in, constantly on the grind, constantly struggling. Those folks don't have the capacity to go to indivisible meetings. They don't have the capacity to read all of the political theory that you and I read. They don't have time to watch all of the think pieces that you and I watch and keep up on the news. That's by Republican design. This is why the DSA talks about how important universal health care is, how important childcare is, how important all of these social safety nets are. They create bandwidth and capacity for people to be involved in civic life. Republicans have spent decades making sure that every American is so incredibly overburdened and maxed out that we can't participate in democracy, that we do not have the capacity to do democracy. This is a major component of how they have been able to push fascism through in this country. We're all running on fumes. When you have a government that provides for the needs of people, that's how you get a thriving democracy. When you have a people who are struggling to meet their basic needs, like Americans have been for decades, that's when you end up with a position where a fascist regime can come in and exploit the circumstances that they've created.